Okay, well, hi everybody. This is a class I'm doing, writing, or teaching a class. Just by way of background, for years we've been talking on and off about the possibility of having a weekly Torah study as opposed to just having it a couple times a month. And my thought has been that we would do that, but the clergy wouldn't teach it every week, that we'd invite other people to lead, which I think that people in this congregation are fully capable of doing, but there's a lot of angst involved in leading, and the Adult Education Committee asked if we could put together a little bit of a workshop, give people some ideas, some materials of things to do, and that's what this class is about. I would say the subtext, it's like that guy doing the infomercial who says, you too can make $1 million doing real estate, just follow what I say, and say, it's that easy. So we'll try to give some ideas. So before we do that, let's just let everybody introduce yourselves, if there's something specific that you're looking for in today's class. Judy, you want to start?
Judy Sachs, just looking for help, encouragement, resources, and colleagues.
And if you've taught some of this before, though, you've done...
I've done these things from time to time, yeah.
The shorter sessions.
Yeah.
Okay.
Fondalo, really just looking to learn more about how you would be a leader in a group like leading. I've studied, but I've never led. Actually, I did.
You did one of the
Yes.
Tikkun El Shavuot a
Yes,
few
I
years ago.
did.
Shorter session also.
Yeah, also a shorter session.
Jerry Reed. What do you want to hear?
Whatever, if there's anything you're looking for.
Not looking for anything.
Okay, very good.
Ireland Mahoney. I guess I'm just looking for wisdom.
Okay.
I'm very open. I don't know what's gonna happen. I mean, I've done some things like this before. Not specifically about Torah. I mean, in the Jewish context, just spiritual teaching in general, like circles and stuff. But I mean, not really a lot. So
And you live in the area?
Yeah, I've always lived around here. I used to live Montreal Forest, like across the street.
Oh, really? Oh, sorry.
Now I live in Wheaton.
Okay.
Try to stay. This is my home. So.
All right, great. We're glad to have you. So, what I wanted to do, sort of for starters, I basically divide this into a couple of pieces. One is my taking 10 or 15 minutes to convince you you can do this. Anybody can do this. We're part of the Jewish conversation. The second piece will be kind of different methodological, critical approaches, ideas for how to build a discussion, and then I do have a whole bunch of resources that are here and some to show you. And then, we could get together and look at the portion and have people write a Dvar Torah for me. I have to give the sermon this week, so if you want to write it for me, that's cool. So we'll see. Just kidding, it's already almost written. Okay, so what I wanted to do, there is a blessing before Torah study, and it's an instructive blessing. It's on the front of the page, and let's read that together. It'll set a bit of a tone of what we're trying to do, and also we'll make a point. So let's read it. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. And I just want to concentrate on the words of that blessing for a second. Because the beginning part is like the blessing for any commandment, right? Baruch atah Eloheinu melech haolam, praise are you, our ruler of the universe, who commanded us, or in technical terms, who sanctified us with the commandments and commanded us. And then la'asok b'divrei Torah. And I want to focus on that word la'asok, because there is a perfectly good Hebrew word for lilmod, right? Or for to study Torah, lilmod Torah, a perfectly good word for lelamed, to teach Torah. What is this word la'asok? Jerry, you're the Hebrew person. What's asakim?
Asakim. Asek? From Asek?
Yeah, from Asek.
Business,
right? Asek is business. La'asok is to busy yourself, to get involved. I use the word immerse. And I think that that's right, sort of a piece of what you're doing when you're studying Torah. It's not always trying to find an answer. It's not always trying to make it all make sense. It's not always trying to find the law. Sometimes it's just sort of the immersion. It's just busying ourselves with the words, right?
There are two other brachot. One is with Seyat Sa'enu.
Okay,
About
so
our
in the morning
inheritance.
service,
Yeah.
right, so in the morning service there are actually 3 blessings that are recited every day when we say the Torah study. There's a piece of study within the Torah service, or within the regular morning service. The first is La'asok b'divrei Torah. The second one is V'ha'arev na, which begins, may the words of Torah be sweet for me and for my children and my children's children and for all who study them. Baruch atah Adonai hamlamed Torah le'amo Yisrael. Praised is God who teaches Torah to his people Israel. And so there is that idea of, Torah should always be sweet. And the third one is the one that we recite when we read Torah. Asher bachar banu mikol hamim, who chose us from among all the peoples and gave us the Torah by giving us the Torah. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah, praise Yahweh who gives Torah. But this is the one specifically for study, as opposed to the kind of ritual use. And the idea is anybody can do it. Another piece, I've quoted many times, you may be familiar with the first teaching in Pirkei Avot, which says Moses received the Torah on Sinai, or actually says Moses received Torah on Sinai and passed it on to Joshua and Joshua to the elders. It's very, we make a big deal out of the fact that he received Torah and not received the Torah, because there is this tradition. It's in Leviticus Rabbi, but it's also in other places, right? So what did Moses receive on Sinai, right? So we quote a verse, the Lord gave me the 2 tablets of stone inscribed by the finger of God and written upon them all the exact words that the Lord had addressed to you on the mountain out of the fire on the day of assembly. Now, the way that Midrash works is you pick Hebrew words and you say, well, maybe the word could have been written differently, maybe they could have chosen a different word. I'm going to extrapolate from that and give an idea. That's not to say that the Torah actually meant what I'm about to say, but if you can make an idea and connect it to a verse, then you're within sort of the rabbinic way. So, what does it mean? What did God get? Rabbi Joshua ben Levi taught, instead of Alehem Ketuvim, right, on them was written, it says Va'alehem Ketuvim, and on them. We're going to make a big deal out of the word and. Instead of all, kol, it says as all, kechol. Instead of words, devarim, it says the words, right? And also, when God talks about the commandments, instead of commandments, mitzvah, it says all the commandments, kol ha-mitzvah. So we're getting words, ha, the, and, as, all, and we're going to make a big deal out of it. Why? This means that scripture, Mishnah, Talmud, additional legends, and even that which a good student will one day recite before his teacher, it was all spoken to Moses on Sinai. As it says, sometimes there's one which we say, look, this one is new. It occurred long since in ages that went before us. Usually, when right, there's nothing right. So usually these verses are understood in a very limiting way. When Ecclesiastes says it, it's right. There's nothing new under the sun. Everything is futile. Don't bother. There's no reason for it. Or you say, well, Moses received it all on Sinai. There's no innovation. That's sort of one way to read the text. The other way to read this text is to say that the process of God giving the Torah on Sinai is an ongoing process. God hasn't finished giving the Torah because the Torah also includes what a student is yet to learn, a student is yet to discover. Another thing that means, right? Anything that somebody else says, anything that you who don't think you're capable of teaching a class because you're not a rabbi, right, is also something that came from Moses on Sinai, meaning that that's all part of the package. My kids like watching Ratatouille, so I don't know if this means anything to you, but the chef, there's anyone can cook, right? It's this is for anybody. Anyway, And then one other text that I've learned many times in rabbinical school and really liked from the Talmud, and this is number 2. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah opened with this teaching. So he takes a verse from Ecclesiastes, and right, it's sort of, you can see where he's going to go because there's a lot of nouns that are unnecessary. The words of the sages are like goads, like nails planted in prodding sticks. They were given by one shepherd. So now we've got to say, why do we use so many words? First of all, what's a goad? No farmers? The goad is the metal, I guess you put the ox and attach it to the cart, and the goads are what you put to make it go straight.
Is that like the
Is in
yoke?
the place.
No, the yoke is on the neck, right? And the harness is what holds it, so he holds onto the wagon. This is like, so you have the harness on you, and then you'd have another thing on the side so you can't turn. Sort of keeps you going, right? Huh? Like well, maybe the chariot, yeah, well, something like. But the chariot has a rider, so that person keeps them there, right? So why are the words of Torah compared to a goad? To teach that just as a goad points the ox in the right direction in order to bring forth life to the world, meaning allow the plants to grow, so do the words of Torah direct those who study them from the path of death to the path of life. So the words of Torah are like a straitjacket. But a goad is something that you go and buy at the hardware store for $29 or whatever it is, right? Were you to think that just as a goad is movable and impermanent, something you can go buy at the hardware store for $29, so too are the words of Torah, movable and impermanent. The text adds like nails. They're stuck in the wall. But a nail's not a good metaphor either, because were you to think that when you punch the wall in the nail into the wall, it disappears, and therefore words of Torah disappear, right? Diminish and never increase. Therefore, the text adds planting. Just as a sapling grows and increases, so do the words of Torah grow and increase. And again, part of the idea is the words of Torah are powerful, and we play the role of allowing them to increase. Our words are part of Torah. In prodding sticks, ba'alei asupot, which if you look at the new JPS translation, it's got the little D's around it that say meaning of Hebrew uncertain. Right? So we don't know what they mean, which means, but if you take the words and you take them out of context, ba'alei asupot are people who sit in, right, what's an asefa? A meeting. People who sit in meetings, right? Okay. So we're going to turn in prodding sticks to people who sit in meetings. These are Torah scholars who sit in various assemblies and immerse themselves in Torah. Some declare things impure while others declares them pure. Some prohibit while others permit. Some declare invalid while others declare valid. A person might ask, how can I possibly study Torah now? The text adds they were all given by one shepherd. One God gave them, one lecturer taught them from the mouth of the blessed Lord of creations, as it is written, God spoke all these words. And again, we're just taking a simple word, kol, and making a mountain out of this, right? He said all these words. Where did I go? You must make your ear as a hopper to hear the words of those who declare pure and those who declare impure, those who prohibit, those who permit, those who declare invalid, and those who declare valid. Again, what is my point here? For that person who says, I can't study this, I can't teach this, because what if I get it wrong? What if I don't interpret it correctly? There's no such thing as a wrong interpretation. The wrong interpretations are also part of Torah. Now, right, even published books, which must be right because they're published, contain ideas that you read them and you say, I disagree, they read the word wrong, and then you have to decide, well, do I want to take the lesson anyway? But even disagreeing becomes part of the lesson, right? I'll just stop there for a second if anybody wants to say anything. I haven't stopped talking. But is this a little bit of a pep talk? I don't know.
Well, I'm just wondering though, is the slate so that open really? I mean, if you're, for example, if you read something because you've, I don't know, I can't think of a good example, but let's say there's a reference and you say to the sample class, well, this really means Jesus or something.
Mm-hmm.
And most of the rabbis say, no, that's really not correct. I mean, I suppose you can put that out there,
Well, you can't, right? So it's just like any other academy. So it's got to pass the smell test, and the smell test, right? And even like a radical thing like that, like you say, it's Jesus, right? The community becomes what's there. So yes, if I said this proves that it's Jesus, I'd be thrown out of this context, right? But there are other people out there who would welcome me in, right? So there is a little bit about what the community's willing to accept. So there is a tradition. The rabbinic tradition is Shiv'im Panim LaTorah. There are 70 faces to Torah, and 70 in sort of rabbinic it's like akin to affinity, right? There's 70 nations in the world. There's 70 languages. That's like saying a million, and that is a way of saying, right? Anything goes. Now the rabbis did have methods for midrash. So stuff that we say is outlandish. They had Rabbi Yishmael had 13 methods of reading the text, and actually Rabbi Akiva had, was it 49 or 52, some other number. And so they did have methods. But even we regularly, right, often we have the other problem, that somebody will give a midrash and say, oh, that's just an old wives' tale, what do we did it? And right, the slate is open for the midrash, and actually as a student it needs to say, well, what was the language they were speaking, what was the method they were using? I can disagree with the way they did it, I can disagree with the conclusion, but that's a valid exercise. And so is, it really is that open. But then you're going to throw out the 70 interpretations, you're not going to like all of them. There are interpretations all over the place that people don't like. And part of the reason it's that wide open is, right, so you don't like an interpretation, does that mean you throw out the text? And what do you do with Tazria? Talking about, this impurity after childbirth. Well, you could just skip it every year, but if we believe the Torah as whole, you come up with new interpretations, sometimes they're more outlandish. On the other hand, and that's sort of part of the answer to your question,
I think
they did, let me just finish the thought, they did, right, when it comes to halakha, when it comes to matters of law, it's not quite there's only one answer because there's no pope and there's no one, but there is more of this is the accepted tradition, you can't just, right, you can't take homosexuality. There's Leviticus 18:20 says, a man can't lie with a man as a woman can't lie with a woman. The halachic process, which we have sort of worked out, right? We mean the conservative movement, right? But when the conservative movement worked it out, it wasn't as simple as, oh, they wrote that a long time ago and therefore it doesn't apply. A Bible scholar could say that, but when you're talking about legal practice, you got to go through a different process. But in terms of interpreting a text to learn what the Torah says, or what the Torah may teach, or creating a sermon, or creating an insight, it really is that wide open. I'm going to show you these 7 interpretations. You were going to say something.
Well, first I'm going to say everyone is male and female. I mean, that's inherent in just the divine name. We're reflections of that. So that could be a kind of a loophole, a joyous loophole.
Oh yeah, well we've created the loopholes. I don't want to go into that now. We've created plenty of loopholes to allow for gay marriage, but yeah.
But anyways, the other thing I was gonna say is just that for me, Torah is the joy in it is not the understanding conceptualization, but the pure, it's divinity. I was born, I grew up in America, so I learned English alphabet, right? And I'm learning this English alphabet as a kid, and this is the first concepts that are given to me. And it's okay, so every time I see the word I'm gonna think fa, all of that. But I think the good thing about Torah is that it wasn't until later that I found really the Hebrew language. So I feel like I can never learn Hebrew, and no one can learn Hebrew. You don't really understand it.
Right, you don't understand it, right.
So it's you're looking at it, and you're just seeing divinity. You can't judge it. Just God is not judging souls in heaven. It's just you're seeing that they're all divine. You're seeing just letters.
Well, and when you say it's divinity, then you just got to ask yourself what you mean by that, right? So it could mean divinity because it's an ancient thing and we have it, but that's the question, and that actually leads in, to sort of the methodological approaches, which we'll get to in 1 second.
You know what I find interesting, like frequently, like you'll stand up in front of the congregation, you'll read something, and then you'll throw it out to the congregation. What do you think? But we really want to know what the rabbis think. I don't think we're capable of, we could say what we think, but it's more important what the rabbis think.
Well,
It shouldn't be like our interpretation. Like you go to the synagogue, you want the rabbinical.
So I'll say two things to that. So one is, I think that there's a difference between a sermon and Torah study. That is, a sermon is an exercise in providing an insight on how to live your life or how to grow as a person or whatever, and that is, right, that is the rabbi or the darshan, whoever it is giving it, where what you're doing in that 10-minute exercise is, what is your insight on this text? Study is, you may have an insight, but it's a give and take process. I will say, right, and part of what I want to give is tools here, and there are some tools that are really available for, right, the people in our world are incredibly well-educated people. Not so necessarily well-educated Jewishly, but incredibly well-educated that with the right sources, there is a way to get access to that sort of traditional thought. I will say that your own approach is a good starting point. And too often, people jump to what did the rabbi say, and they're getting the answers before they've asked the questions. Right? Just reading a text and then reading Rashi is jumping to the answers. Reading a text and coming up with a question and maybe formulating a half an answer in my head and then kind of seeing what other people said over the course of 3,000 years of interpretation. Well, then you're using the other texts, for a good reason.
So you started this out by saying how the Adult Education Committee, really, there were people that really wanted this. And I think that, as you said, Jerry, I think that publicizing it to the congregation is going to be important in them understanding it's lay-led, and maybe expectations are different, but I'm kind of even thinking about it as, presentation would be different as well. And you and I have talked about how you can facilitate a conversation instead of leading the conversation.
So let's move on, and I think that's it. So let me just give you sort of some different ways to look at a text, and then I've got some pieces, and some of this gets into conservative approaches, and I just threw a few pieces together. So source criticism, right? So we don't always say it all the time, but it's pretty much a given in the conservative movement. The Torah was written by human authors, by usually, say for easy reference, 4 human authors, J, E, D, and P. J and E are generally, especially once you get past Exodus 6, pretty hard to tear apart which one is which. D and P a little bit more, and these schools have different approaches that helps you to understand things like, why is the law of the sabbatical years different in Leviticus versus Deuteronomy? Why is the story of the flood in Genesis, recited and then it's repeated again? And in one place it says that you should take the animals 2 by 2, and another place it says you should take the animals 7 by 7. Source criticism takes you to a certain point there. I would say that today when we study, the most we sort of need out of source criticism is to not be afraid of it. Because it doesn't tell you that much, to rip across the text.
If you talk about conservative Judaism and...
Let me just finish this thought. Let me finish this thought. Because sort of the next level above source criticism takes us into what you would call literary criticism, which is it's on the next page. I'll go out of order for a second. The conservative movement approach, or really modern scholars' approach, is to say, okay, so you can tear up the texts into different sources, but so what? Do you believe that 2,000 years worth of people reading this text were idiots because they didn't notice that they were speaking in different voices? Do you believe that the redactor, the one who attached the text together, didn't know what he was doing? No, we don't believe that. So you've got to read the text as a whole anyway. And so finding different voices is only a starting point, and then you want to ask yourself, well, why is the text written this way? The difference between a literary approach and the yeshiva approach is that a literary approach says it was written by humans and it was put together by a redactor, but I want to read the text as a whole. And the yeshiva approach says it was written by God, and if you see different voices, because God tried to fool us, but I'm still going to try to come up with reasons why the text is written differently. A lot of times your answers end up coming, and that's where the conservative movement piece comes in, because we accept the source criticism, but say, wait a minute, the medieval rabbis saw those same problems in the text, and they had answers to it. So now suddenly we care what they said. But so that's another kind of approach, is to say, why is the text written this way? We'll give some examples. Another way to read a text is what's called leading words, light words. Certain words might be repeated several times. I was just, huh?
B'nai Israel.
Well, yeah, that's, B'nai Israel is a name. It's like saying Moses is repeated too many times. But let's say you take a passage, or I'll give another example. Like that's a good example. The story of the Tower of Babel. So in that story, it's an 11-verse story. People wanted to build a tower. God got upset. They spread them out. The words "Kol haaretz," all the land, are repeated 5 times. 11 verses. That's a lot. So then an interpreter can say, well, why are those words repeated so many times? What's it trying to teach? Right? Is it that man's corruption was so big that it encompassed the whole earth? Is it trying to say an underlying message of people live everywhere, they speak all different languages, but there's only one God who's ruler over Kol haaretz, over all the earth? It could be anything. I'll give an example that goes with the B'nai Israel. So Jacob changes his name to Israel, right? But unlike when Abram changes his name to Abraham, he's never called Abram again. Jacob is called Israel repeatedly. And if you read like the stories of Joseph in Egypt, and especially the end of the story, it goes back and forth where you're calling him Jacob and then you're calling him Israel. So I don't have a definitive answer, although I have an idea that seems to work. But so a leading word question. Well, why does the Torah change its description from Jacob to Israel? Let's read that together. Maybe we come up with some answers. I happen to think that whenever the Torah is talking about something that affects national issues, it uses Israel. When it's talking about family issues, it uses Jacob. But because Jacob fills both of those roles. But that's leading words.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So are you trying to get us to comment on what you're saying as it's going?
Well, I'm trying to throw out pieces to try to get you to think. If I want to read a text, and the next time we do is sort of how to isolate what you're actually studying, but if I want to read a text, what are the avenues that I can use? How do I want to jump in? How do I want to approach it?
I get what you're saying.
Right. The feminist criticism there. There are 2 different ways to do feminist criticism and 2 different ways to read a story. Right. So one way is to say, hey, look, there are women in the Bible. They're great people. We love Miriam. We love Ruth. Right. Whatever. A second approach is to be more critical and to say, well, the text was written by men.
Mickey, is this your interpretation, or is this the conservative movement?
Well,
if the conservative movement
doesn't have a dogma on how to interpret Torah.
No, but I mean, the conservative movement says the Torah was not given by God; people created the text.
But
did they write this?
Room.
I mean, I never heard this growing up. This
really?
is something now.
Was Torah
I never heard about Moshiach growing up. This is something recently. If the seminary writes about conservative Judaism, do they say, we do not believe God gave us a Torah, we believe it was written by man?
So usually, it's not written in a negative that way. All right.
But do they?
So
do
what they would say is, we believe that modern critical Bible scholarship that's taught in the university has something to teach us as Jews.
But they don't address.
Oh, boy.
They're running around and not addressing.
Look, I studied at the Jewish Theological Seminary. I didn't make this stuff up.
Yeah.
I studied at the University of Michigan, and then I went to the Jewish Theological Seminary. I didn't feel in rabbinical school that the Bible that I learned in the University of Michigan was different in the way they taught it. We definitely did more medieval scholarship. But yes, this is the way that it's taught. So I'm going to switch it into a multiple choice problem. All right. One approach, the earlier approach of Bible scholarship or of conservative movement, was to say source criticism, or what they would call higher criticism. Higher because lower criticism is like textual criticism to know whether there's a yud in the text or not a yud in different manuscripts. But that higher Bible criticism is the same as higher anti-Semitism. The original way in the 19th century that source criticism was used was to say the order of the sources is J, E, D, and P. And the P source is all worried about sacrifices and blood and things we don't care about. And that the nature of the Bible was that it was purely spiritual. And then these priests came along and corrupted it. And oh, by the way, Jesus came and fixed it back to the right way. But now we have proof that the Jews messed up the Torah and, God. So that was an underlying thing. The approach, right? And then you were left with take it or leave it, right? So a traditional approach would say, well, forget about it. The next sort of level in the conservative movement would be to say, maybe there's source criticism, but we're just going to ignore it, right? Now, so a reform approach in the 19th century would have said these medieval rabbis were part of the Middle Ages, and nothing good came out of the Middle Ages, and there's nothing they could teach us, right? I'm going to show you these things, but you can see it all in the Chumashim that we use, right? And I'll show you that in a second. But would say there's nothing good from there; it's all modern scholarship. My wife was studying at Pardes, pluralist but Orthodox institution, and they're sitting down and saying, who wrote the Bible? And the Orthodox approach was, no. God wrote the Bible, but God is God, and so he can use the J voice and the D voice. And if you think that it's multiple authors, that's because God was testing you. That's the same sort of approach that says, how is the world 5,777 years old when we have the dinosaur bones that are, billions of years old? And it's because God put the dinosaur bones there 5,777 years ago to see to test your faith. The modern sort of conservative movement approach is not only do we not have to ignore or deny critical scholarship, but that we as Jews can learn from critical scholarship. All right? And I'll just show you in the thing. So once upon a time we joked, the one thing that united all the movements was that everybody used the blue Hertz Chumash. Joseph Hertz actually was a graduate of the Jewish Theological Seminary, right? Mm-hmm. And actually, a lot of that commentary denied source criticism. That's what he did. Today, Reform, Conservative, Orthodox all use different books. The Reform uses this book by Gunther Plaut, which is nice, and we'll talk about it, but you wouldn't know that there were 2,000 years of Jewish scholarship by reading it. It's all but ignored. All right? The Orthodox use this stone chumash, which is printed very beautifully. It's got Rashi's text in its entirety, right? Because the Orthodox approach is to say Rashi is the translation of the text, whereas the conservative approach is to say Rashi was a guy who lived in the 11th century and he was a cool guy, but he was just a guy. And then you have interpretations that are all written by rabbis, and you would think that nobody studied the Torah who wasn't leading a yeshiva in Poland, right?
I think that's from just the Jewish tradition of you're trying to seem like a Jew,
Right, well, this is like to say that it's an authentically Jewish.
Talk about Torah.
Exactly.
Like Pardes is like, you know, like you're saying this JEDP stuff, but I'm really, and you're talking about the medieval rabbis, and that really reminds me more like Pardes, you know, like.
Right. Well, there's a different. That's right. There's a different interpretation.
Like what is it, the
Well, those are different. Pardes is four different approaches: the pshat and the remez and the drash and the sod, and that's a different. I don't want to get into that right now, but right, those are different ways. The conservative text that we're using, the Eitz Chaim, consists of, first of all, it's the JPS, the scholarly translation, which is the same translation that Plout uses, and then you have two different commentaries. You have a commentary that is a scholarly commentary, essentially a summary of the 5-volume JPS text, right? It's a sort of an abbreviated version. And then below that, you have midrashic commentary. What does the midrash say? What do Hasidic rabbis in the 19th century? These aren't, sort of scholarly interpretations of the text, but they are other modes of answering the same question. So the approach definitely is, it's all part of the same tradition of reading the text. And that idea here on the feminist criticism, the other way of doing feminist criticism is to be critical of the text, right? So you read a text like, we'll go back to Tazria again for a second, and when a woman gives childbirth, if she gives birth to a boy, she's impure for 33 days, and when she gives birth to a girl, she's impure for 66 days, and your first question is to ask, why, right? And one approach would be to say, well, there must be a reason. Let me read a text. I'll see what people said about that. And the other is to say, well, maybe the Torah had a different view than I have today. And then you got to ask the question, well, what do I do with that? Right? And clearly, when there are other texts that aren't, when you're dealing with Judah and Tamar, maybe it's a little bit easier to deal with than with Tazria, because at least it's a story. But that's sort of right. So I put feminist here, but it's really short for being critical of the text and not being afraid to say, if this was written today, how would it be written differently? Now, after you ask the question, you got to say, okay, the rabbis were also bothered by some texts, so what were their answers matter, and don't be afraid. Canonical criticism, which you probably wouldn't do as much, but that's saying, why did this book get in here? Or even to ask, okay, so it says, kill all the Midianites, right? What was Moses' wife's name?
Zipporah.
Zipporah, okay, and where was she from?
Midian.
Midian. Oh, so how can the same Torah say, kill all the Midianites, but Moses is married a Midianite? And oh, by the way, the Midianites are part of Moab. Where's Ruth from? Right, so we do have these different voices within the text.
It's the higher Torah. There's the Malchut Torah. Then there's all the other Safra Torah that you see at one time.
Well, that's a mystical approach. That's right. Different views. And then the last piece here is just sort of the history of interpretation. And again, right, that's sort of saying, okay, I have a question. I'm going to give an answer. How did other people answer the question over the ages, right? And that works. That works with a lot of things. But there's a great example here. Jacob sends Joseph out into the fields to go find out about his brothers. And when he gets there, he ends up thrown in a pit, and he goes down there. Everything is him. But he can't find his brothers. And the text says he met a man on the road and asked about his brothers. And he showed him where he were. So who was the man? He's not named. Right? So the Midrash says, and Rashi quotes and says, no, it was the angel Gabriel. Right? Couldn't have just been a man, because this person, set history going on. Ibn Ezra lived, in Egypt 100 years later. Said, what are you talking about? It says a man. He's just a man. He's showing up. Things happen by chance sometimes, right? And so that gives an opportunity. Yeah.
I mean, maybe it was preordained. That's what the Orthodox would say.
Well,
Hashem
You're,
directed
you're
this.
putting this into 19th century questions of Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform,
That's fine.
and having a little bit of doubt as to what I'm saying is traditional. This is really off the plane of Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform, and into over the period of 2,000 years, rabbis who didn't have labels of Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform also had this. Rashi was an Orthodox rabbi, Ibn Ezra was an Orthodox rabbi, Nachmanides was an Orthodox rabbi, and they all disagreed about this. I don't think that when it comes to like interpreting Torah just to interpret it and find meaning, that the Orthodox and Conservative disagree. Because they accept Shivim Panim Torah. The fact that I would say that the text was written by multiple authors, in my view, that's just like accepting of reality, because to put your head in the sand and not accept the world that's out there. To deny authors is like to deny evolution, which some people do. But that's not my approach. But in terms of what your result, there's no difference between them. Orthodox rabbis are more familiar with rabbis from Poland of the 19th century. We tend to concentrate on 15th century and earlier. That's the difference. Okay, so that's kind of there. How are we doing for time? No, we're fine. So how do you read a text? Are we supposed to give examples and maybe try to make one? I mean, I wrote some ideas here, and please tell me if I'm leaving stuff out and what there is. But when I'm thinking of a class, I think that the first thing to do is to read the text without commentary. How many people own a new JPS translation of the Bible?
So you mean Eitz Hayim?
It's Chaim or the JPS Tanakh.
I own the JPS.
Yeah. So it's
I
yeah.
have Eitz Hayim, it's not easy.
I have Eitz Hayim.
You do have Eitz Hayim? Or you don't?
I think I have that at home, and I have the Hertz.
Yeah, the Hertz.
But I don't think I have.
I don't find the Hertz terribly useful anymore because the English is not English that you can read. The JPS translation, which exists in many different forms, that is the translation that's using Eitz Hayim. It's blue in the hardback, the English hardback, and there's also a leather bound. This one happens to be Hebrew and English. The Torah, all of these commentaries also have the JPS translation. It's written in a clear way, and when there are words where people don't agree on the answer, you've got that famous note, meaning of Hebrew uncertain, which gives you a nice starting point. But just to read the text and to outline it, and I don't have a marker. But by outlining, I mean a simple one. The first part of the text is this week is Re'eh, God gives you a choice, a blessing and a curse. 2, it's talking about tzedakah. 3, it's talking about the holidays. It's just a very simple thing to make yourself a list of what happens. And then the next step is to kind of, once you've read through it once, and that's a very traditional way also, because there's a tradition that you are supposed to read the Torah 3 times every week, the portion. They say once through and twice with interpretation. Once you've read the text through, to go back on the list and say, well, what's the area I want to concentrate on, right? What's
There's so much, like when I've been asked to give Divrei Torah,
right? Right, and so you might introduce a discussion by saying all these things happen, but I just want to focus here. I mean, we're starting this stuff in Genesis, and in Genesis, the story of Noah. So you've got the building, you've got the flood, and 2 different versions of the flood. And then you got the rainbow. And then you got Noah coming out and getting drunk and having the issue with Ham and his sons. And then you've got the issue of the Tower of Babel. And then you've got the genealogies, which are also an interesting way, interesting ideas. Maybe you can do 2 if you're going to do half-hour discussions, but you really have to limit it down. And when you reread the smaller piece, there are ways to then find some questions. I really believe and our ability as intelligent adults to read the text and ask a question and trust that it's a good question. And then once we've read it and trust it's a good question, that's when we start looking at sources and maybe see when somebody else did it. And if we don't find somebody else approaching that same question, that's when you ask somebody. You know, I have facility to other, right? What's interesting, a rabbi and a layperson, I do have facility with more texts, fine, and can help get people in the right answer. But trust your ability to ask the first question. There is this great, I copied it for you, the third page is here. This is from myjewishlearning.com. 7 approaches, and myjewishlearning.com is a great resource anyway, but 7 approaches to writing a Devar Torah, and I like these, right? You've got the microscope. So I'm going to focus on the small aleph at the end of the word Vayikra, and the first word in the book of Leviticus, and see what other people said about it, or some small piece, right? I'm going to focus on the 4 verses of, it says, Cain spoke to Abel, and they went into the field, and Abel killed, what were the exact words? Sorry.
Can I ask how you're finding, like, where is it documented where people are talking about this? Like,
What do you mean, where people are talking about?
like you're saying, for example, if I focus on that aleph, it's like,
Oh,
how do I find the people? Where are these?
right. So some of them are in the text that I gave you, right? And the thing is, I mean, the story of Jewish interpretation of the text is, well, I say 3,000 years, but well, yeah, it is 3,000 years of study. So I could give you the rundown if you want it, but you have basically from the year 0 to 500, the rabbis of the Talmud writing, whether it's